Our next speaker is a nuclear physicist, entrepreneur, as well as venture capitalist. His name is Patrick Ennis. Put your hands together for Patrick, please.
Well, thank you, everybody. Really excited to be here. It's been a wonderful couple of days. And what's really struck me the most is the energy level and the enthusiasm and the informality of the conference. Yesterday, I had on my suit and tie, and I was so happy when people said I could take it off and put on my normal entrepreneurial clothes. The other thing that struck me is a sense of humor that everyone has. And someone asked me the other day, what is the most important trait that an entrepreneur needs to have? And I think Naval, in his wonderful talk yesterday morning, really addressed that point. And it's a sense of humor, in my opinion. Because as an entrepreneur, there's rough days ahead. Things aren't always easy. Eventually you will succeed, but there's times where you feel like giving up. And I just wanted to start by relaying a story that in hindsight is funny, but at the time was crushing. Many years ago, in the mid-90s, my firm helped start a company in the oil exploration business. So it was a gravity meter, basically a 200-kilogram device about this big that you would put on a boat, and it could accurately measure gravity and thus could figure out where oil and natural gas was because it could measure the undersea formations. So we raised venture capital, and we had about 20 or 30 people, invested millions of dollars, and we had very little money left. But we had enough money to hire a boat to take it out in the Gulf of Mexico and actually try to see if it worked. And it was working perfectly. And then we get a call the following week in the middle of the night saying that the boat sunk in the Gulf of Mexico. And we thought it was a joke. We thought someone was playing a prank on us and teasing us. Once we realized it was true, the first thing we said is, oh my God, did anybody die? And it turns out everyone got off the boat okay. And then the next question is, please tell me you saved the device. That was our only prototype. Please tell me you saved it. And unfortunately, 200 kilograms of steel went right down to the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico. And that company went bankrupt, and that was the end of the story. It's nice. It's taken me 16 years. Now I can laugh about it. From a societal perspective, it turned out well because the IP, the intellectual property, was saved, and someone bought the idea and rebuilt it eventually. But for that entrepreneurial team, that was a horrible ending. But all the people involved in that project went on to do better things, and they've had success, and they've made money. So we all laugh about it now. But talk about a failure. And that's as big as you can get when your boat falls to the bottom of the ocean along with your hard work. So for this presentation, I'm going to mix it up a little bit. We've been focused mostly on startups and venture capital and pure information technology, such as software and internet. And here we're going to talk about other technology. And we're also going to talk about alternative ways to monetize your ideas. And it's something that we call invention capital. So I'm going to explain what it is and describe why we need more of it. So here's the outline. I'm going to talk for exactly 30 minutes, maybe a little bit less, and that'll save about 30 minutes for question and answer. And I really hope we have a lot of interaction like we've had in the previous sessions. And no question is too difficult or too controversial to ask. It's Friday afternoon. We want to keep the energy level up, so please don't be shy in formulating your questions. And then we're going to finish off talking about entrepreneurship. So here's the essence of the talk. That's Thomas Edison, probably the single most important and most productive inventor of all time. And he did his work outside of New York City in the late 1800s. And you know, he invented the first commercial light bulb, the phonograph, and so many other parts of modern life. And what's interesting about him is he found a way to systematically invent with a large team. He was able to scale. He had 100+ people in his laboratory. He also had a unique view that was different than the European tradition at the time, which was a little bit stuffy, with the professors thinking more just about pure knowledge for the sake of knowledge. Edison wasn't proud. He wanted to solve problems and change the world. So one of his famous sayings is, genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. So what that means is it's nice to be smart, but it's better to work hard. And it's better to be lucky, as you've heard in many of these other sessions. And that was some other advice I gave yesterday when someone asked me, what other advice should you give an entrepreneur? And that was simple. It was work hard. Nothing else matters. Edison worked hard, and he changed the world. The other thing that Edison said is to invent, you need imagination and a large pile of junk. And he wasn't teasing. That sounds like a silly saying, but if you're going to come up with ideas, you have to let your mind roam free. You can't plan it in advance. So in his laboratory, he had a bunch of junk. It was a playground. He had materials from all over the world. He had different devices, and he let his staff just play around with it and to come up with something that would work. And we do that in software, too. In the virtual world, you want access to libraries of all sorts of routines, to all sorts of programs, to all sorts of web services, and you never know what's going to pop out at you. So the reason we're focused on invention is anything worthwhile should have a separate market. But somehow through the years, invention has been forgotten because it's been merged with either research and development or with product development on the other side. And I'll talk about that in the next slide. But invention is actually a separate activity, and we need to focus on it. And the only way to focus on it is to give inventors the ability to earn a living by being an inventor. Most inventors are not good business people. They're not good product developers, so we shouldn't expect them to be. We should expect them to invent, and then we should help them get their ideas to market. And the last bullet item is critically important because the world of business has changed. In the old days, companies were organized, such as AT&T with their Bell Laboratories, or Siemens with their central research function. But now, even those large companies are looking outwards for innovation, kind of an open source and open innovation model. Small companies can't afford to have captive R&D groups. Governments and NGOs need innovation, and who's going to supply that? Venture capital is a part of the answer, but not the complete answer. So here's a slide I call the missing middle. I just talked about research and development on one side and product development on the other. It's relatively easy to get money for research and development because it captures the imagination. You can say we're going to cure malaria, we're going to do research on AIDS, we're going to solve the energy problem. You can convince people to give you money for that. It's easy to attract brilliant minds into the field because maybe they'll get a Nobel Prize or they'll get tenure at a university. On the other side, short-term product development, it's easy to get money for that because there's very little risk. You can say, give me this money now, and 6 months from now I'll produce the product and sell it. So you can attract people there. But the critical piece is the transition from R&D to the market. How do you do that? How do you attract funding to it? And how do you attract the best people to it? Well, we know one way to do that, and we've talked about that over the last couple days. Invention is in the middle, and venture capital helps provide that bridge by giving money to entrepreneurs to form startup companies. But if you look at the macro numbers, and I know we're focused on startups here, but if you look at the macro numbers of the economy, it's, I don't know, $65 trillion, maybe $70 trillion worldwide economy. Venture capital is a teeny portion of that. Google is very rare. It's 1 out of 30,000. We should all hope to have a Google, but you can't base your whole strategy on finding a Google. You should do a lot of startups, but there's also many types of invention that will never find their way into a startup, because either the venture capitalists are not interested in that particular area because it's not trendy enough, or more likely it's an idea for a product, not for a company. But that's still valuable, and how do you get that to market? And invention capital can be one way to do that. So let's talk about invention, because different people mean different things. And here's a couple examples that we want to chat about. And it's really interesting. It shows you that there's no one path to success. There's no one path to enlightenment. There's no way to really teach how to do invention and how to do innovation. And that's a theme we've heard from many of the panelists and many of the speakers over the last few days. So you probably haven't thought much about nylon, but in many ways it changed the world, and all of these have changed the world. Nylon is a wonderfully hard plastic that has great properties, was discovered before World War II by accident. It was a sloppy chemist in the United States working for DuPont who had a beaker with a solution in it, and he forgot to clean up his laboratory when he went home for the evening. He came back in the morning, and that beaker had hardened into this wonderful material called nylon. Now, that may not seem all that exciting to you, but it certainly changed the outcome of World War II because nylon was used for many parts of that enterprise, ropes, tying down packages on shipping vessels. And another interesting thing about nylon, which I recently read to prep for this talk, may sound silly, but it's a consumer product. In the very old days, only rich people, only rich women could have hosiery that they wore on their legs because it was made of silk. And it was very expensive. When nylon was invented, they came up with a way to spin it into a fabric, and then middle class and poor people could have nylons. Now, that doesn't mean much to me because it's not something I'm personally interested in, but it's an example of how technology democratizes life and spreads the wealth, and all from this mistake, all from this mistaken invention. Yellow Post-it notes is another example. We see those everywhere. They're ubiquitous, the little yellow sticky notes that you put on walls and put on paper. That was a failed adhesive at 3M, another multinational corporation. The adhesive was too weak to do anything else, and they were going to throw it out. Instead, a really smart marketing person said, wait a minute, this isn't a bug, it's a feature. Let's raise the price and charge more for this failed adhesive. And, you can say maybe Post-it notes didn't change the world, but they certainly are everywhere, and it's been a big success. So to talk about two inventions in the electronics era, let's talk about the transistor. That was a dedicated invention that was come up with by Bell Laboratories and AT&T in the 1940s. And it was directed invention where marketing people went to the R&D people and said, we have these things called vacuum tubes. They're heavy, they're made out of glass, they break, they're hot, they consume a lot of energy, and we can't seem to shrink them down to size. Can you come up with something that solves those problems? And they did. It was called the transistor. And then the transistor is the foundation for pretty much everything we have today. Most people think of the transistor as a proof point of basic R&D, but it was actually directed R&D from the marketing people. Sure, it built upon the discoveries of many quantum physicists going back decades, but the actual program was directed invention. And the same thing for Edison's lamp, for the filaments. Other people invented the lamp. It wasn't Edison. But what he did is he invented a practical lamp that was cost-effective and reliable that the average person could use, similar to the nylon example. And what he did, because he wasn't proud, he wasn't stuffy, he wasn't arrogant, he did it through trial and error. Remember that large pile of junk in the corner of his laboratory? He tried thousands of different materials, and finally, the filament that made sense inside of his lamp was carbonized bamboo, of all things. He took bamboo, just the plant, and burned it, and that was the initial filament. And as you know, of course, tungsten eventually supplanted carbonized bamboo. But I tell that story because all great entrepreneurs and all great inventors are not proud and they are not intellectually stuffy. If you would have given me that problem to solve when I was a graduate student 25 years ago, I would have solved that equation below. Does anyone recognize that equation, by the way? Maybe one person could humor me and pretend. That's the Dirac equation. So that's the Schrodinger wave equation mixed with Einstein's theory of relativity. So basically, if you solve that for every point in the universe, you have the whole universe figured out in one equation. It's an important equation. So we would have solved that. It would have taken us 37 years. And then at the end, we would have raised our hand and said, try carbonized bamboo. That wasn't really a very efficient way to come up with an answer or an invention. It was intellectually satisfying, but it didn't do any good for the product. So Edison had a much better way of going about invention. And all great entrepreneurs have that same way. But we shouldn't get too carried away. There's something called survivor bias when we talk about successes. We always talk about Google or Twitter. But as was noted yesterday, most things we get involved in don't work. Solar power was a failure for almost the first 200 years. A French scientist actually discovered it in 1839. He had a beaker with some material, and he brought it out in the sun, and he saw the electrons flowing. And what's funny is he didn't write down what material he had. It was probably one of the common ones we use today, but I always wonder if maybe he discovered something that we just haven't rediscovered yet, and it would change the world. So, note to self, when you have an exciting development, write it down. And in today's Twitter world, sometimes that's lost because we don't document things as well as we should. And of course, email, 1844. That's no exaggeration. That was the first Morse code, and that absolutely met all modern definitions of what email was. In 1866, they had the first transatlantic cable. So the United States and Europe were sending email to each other in 1866. Now, it wasn't fully democratized. It didn't spread to the masses, to middle class and poor people, until advances in fiber optics and software and everything else allowed us to do what we're all doing today. But it took hundreds of years. So that should make you feel good, right? We're part of this big journey. You're not alone. It's a constant motion. And sometimes things are failures forever. Nuclear fusion power, I can talk about that because in the old days I used to do some of that. And scientists are wonderful at convincing government people to just give them more money. Oh, you know, give me another 10 million and 10 years from now I'll change the world. So, you know, it's now 2011 and quite frankly commercial fusion power is no closer than it was in the late 1940s. And that's a shame because it's consumed a lot of resources that could have gone to other areas. And then room temperature superconductors, it was first discovered in 1987. And all these years later, all we have are some niche products. And it didn't change the world. But that's okay. You win some, you lose some, right? I mean, that's one of the messages you hear about entrepreneurship and all R&D. So I'm just going to go quickly through these slides because it's all well and good to cherry pick successful examples. But if you're building a portfolio and ultimately all investors, and by investors, I don't just mean venture capitalists, I mean universities and governments and even you over the course of your career have the opportunity to get involved in many different types of activities. So a key point is you really need to think about where you want to stand along the diversification axes, right? So this is pretty simple, just basic portfolio theory. What country do you want to go after? What technologies, what markets? I met an entrepreneur in Singapore last week from Sri Lanka who developed a new software for telecom companies, and his first market is Indonesia. And I found that fascinating because if this were 10 or 20 years ago, he would have been talking about his first market had to be the US. But you know, the US wasn't even on his radar screen at this point because there's, and forgive me, 250 million people in Indonesia, maybe 260 million by now. That's a huge market. He didn't feel the need to go to the US. And that's an exciting development. And we've also talked about that over the last few days. This one gets its own slide because it's risk-reward. And this is really something important for you to think about. If you want a home run, like an anti-gravity machine on the left, or maybe a time machine, I'm not sure what that's supposed to represent, if you succeed, you will make lots and lots of money. But the odds of you succeeding are very low because there's a lot of challenges, not just to developing an anti-gravity machine, but selling one. If you have a new metal bending technology, you're probably not going to get $1 billion Groupon or Facebook IPO, but you can probably sell it and make a little money. And there's nothing wrong with that. If your passion is metal bending and you can change the metal bending industry, you'll make some money and you'll do some good for the world. But these are fundamental questions that you have to answer for yourself. So this slide talks about what we just said before about the Sri Lankan entrepreneur selling software in Indonesia. Sorry to be self-referential, but it's really informed my career and why I've spent the last 12 years traveling through Asia and working throughout Asia for 50% of my time. When I started my graduate program in 1985, there were 22 of us starting their PhDs in physics, and I was one of the few people that looked like me. I was an Irish guy from New York. All of my other friends were from Asia. And all these years later, this cohort, they're all in the US. Most of them have become citizens. And I became good friends with them, and I still am. And at the time, in '85, I said, hey, why'd you come here? And they all said, you know, we never want to go home. Because think about it. In 1985, Beijing wasn't as rich as it is today. It wasn't as nice to live as it is today. And you could pick so many Asian cities. But that's changed. In 2011, in all my travels, I meet smart young kids everywhere. And many of them don't even bother to come to Europe or the US for their PhD. They go to Tsinghua in Taipei or in Beijing or PKU in Beijing or NUS in Singapore. Or if they do come to the US and do their PhD at Stanford, they don't want to stay. They go back home because there's family there. There's greater career opportunities. The cities are cleaner and safer in many ways. So that's a good thing, right? The rest of the world is wealthy. The rest of the world is innovating. And, you know, a rising tide lifts all boats, as they say. But it's a challenge for the United States. And it's a challenge for Europe. So for me, I saw the writing on the wall in 1985. I said, hey, I'm going to learn as much as I can about the Asian markets and Asian universities and Asian technologies. And that's why I'm here. I mean, I love my country, and I think we all should. And we should all be proud of loving our country. But I love other countries, too. And this really just hits it home for me. And just to further belabor the point, here's a photograph of some of my team members. Some are based in Seattle, some are based throughout Asia. It's a glorious mosaic of humanity, right? When you look at that. There's men, there's women, we have 2 Malaysians, we've got folks from Singapore, it's Chinese, Japanese, Indian, and we didn't set out to construct this so it looks good on a slide. These were the best people that we could find in the world, the best technologists and the best entrepreneurs. And science was the first enterprise to really be international, and then business has become international. And I think that's a good thing for everybody's future. Okay, so you know what? I got to be honest, I have no idea what the slide means. I really don't, but I always think every presentation should have kind of one slide that I affectionately call a management consulting slide, right? It's a random collection of circles and arrows that really means nothing, but you paid a lot of money for someone to do it. And so that's just a little editorial comment, because I really don't know what it means, so I'm just going to skip it. So, yeah, you know, I'm not a smart man, as they say. I managed to get a couple degrees here and there, but I learned my lesson. Yeah, I'll never spend money for a slide like that again. So speaking of not being smart, this slide, if you're thinking about what you want to do for your business and for your life, try to be smart. But remember what I said at the beginning, it's more important to work hard and to try to be lucky. And it's more important to talk to other people. Because on this slide, this describes how we figure out where we want to invest in and what the big trends are. Only the first bullet item talks about being smart. All the rest is about listening to other people and cribbing from other folks. I mean, you have the internet, and not to sound like an old guy, but you know, when I was your age, I didn't have the internet. And it was hard to get information. I had to walk to the library, and then you had to flip through the old card catalog, really showing my age. There's no excuse for you not to learn everything you need to learn. You're only limited by the time that you want to spend in front of a browser. So original thinking is great, and you need that. That's a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient. You need to spend a lot of your time doing all of those other activities below. And one of the things you should do when you're thinking of your startup is construct a value ladder. This one I put together for material science. You could do one for software, where maybe an operating system would be at the bottom, assembler language, and at the top would be web services. You could do one for pharmaceuticals. But figure out where you want to enter the market. And once you enter the market, do you want to go up or down, or do you want to stay there? So this is a simple example. You start with sand, and sand is silicon dioxide. You can make silicon chips from it. You can make computers from that. You can make flat panel displays. And then at the top is services and compliance. You can have television shows. That's a service. It's a television show of some old British judges. So I put that there to remind you about compliance and government regulations. Governments always try to help. They truly mean well. But sometimes with the stroke of a pen, they can impact your business as standards change, for instance, in the wireless market. So you really have to figure out where is your place in that value ladder. And you should spend a lot of time on that. I referred to this earlier because it's sort of a non sequitur, but we're in the Twitter era. And again, not to sound like an old fogey, but people don't write down things as much as they used to. And one of my old mentors at Bell Labs years ago, she always told me the documenting is as important as the documents. So even if you don't intend to share it with everybody, at least take some time and think and shut everything off. Shut off your computer and just sit in a corner and think carefully, and then write down your thoughts on your business plan about where the market is going, about what technologies you're developing, about what the challenges are that you face. And I just find people don't do that enough. And the problem, if you don't write it down, you're going to forget, and you're going to have to relearn. More importantly, you owe it to the next generation, whether that's a short-term generation of your employees that you hire in 5 years when you're wildly successful, or 30 years from now when people are trying to figure out exactly what you did. So I'm going to touch upon some technology areas pretty quickly. Nanotech was such a big boom. Remember about 8 years ago, that's all people were talking about in Silicon Valley? And now people don't talk about it much, which is funny, because it's like, shouldn't someone take responsibility for the billions of dollars that was lost investing in nanotech? And the reason is why. That was the past, right? We found new things to invest in, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's the optimism that we bring. But nanotech failed as an asset class because it was never an asset class. It was an underlying technology. It wasn't a market. It wasn't a product. So I'm a tech geek, and I'm proud of it. But I know that all successful businesses succeed because they focus on a customer and a product and a market. And the technology is critical, but if all you focus on is the technology, you'll lose money. Pharmaceuticals and biotech is a great area. The world's population is aging. It's a huge market. But it can be difficult because of regulatory concerns, liability, especially in the US with all the attorneys suing everybody. And they always joke, what's the best way to make a small fortune in biotechnology? And you know, the answer is start out with a big fortune. And you'll lose some of it, and hopefully you'll stop wasting your money and you'll retain a small fortune. And alternative energy, I'm going to talk about on the next slide. A trendy area, makes you feel good about yourself, but you're probably going to lose money unless your market and technology stands on its own and isn't dependent upon government subsidies forever. Government subsidies can be helpful to kickstart it, but if that's your business plan, you'll fail. And we're seeing that already, right? There's this famous example in the United States that's been in the headlines the last few weeks of a big solar company in California that took $500 million of government money, even when most people knew, oh, I'm being kind, even when everyone knew, who knew anything about the technology, that it wouldn't work. So that's an investment loss for people because they were dependent on government subsidies. So back to energy. If you study history, energy is good, and it's correlated with progress. We shouldn't demonize energy. Energy gives us everything we have. And we should focus on efficiency, but efficiency only gets you so far. We will always need to generate, store, and transmit energy. We're sure betting a lot on windmills and solar, but there's some funny anecdotes that we've been reading about recently. The deployment of windmills is being slowed in many markets because it kills a lot of rare birds, believe it or not. The birds are attracted to the noise, and they're being killed by the thousands. So lawsuits are stopping the deployment. The noise of the windmills is affecting people. I read something interesting about solar panels. They're black and hot, and it attracts mosquitoes, and they hover above, and then they fall down and die. And then the bats that eat the mosquitoes die, and bats are critically important. So you tell these stories, nothing's easy in life. And then the energy density of both those technologies doesn't really get you where you need to get yet. I mean, there's an entrepreneurial opportunity there to improve the energy density. But I bring you hope. And the hope is on the next page. The energy equation, it's changed. But we haven't accepted it because most people don't even know about it. But it's really, really simple. It's starting to be in the news recently. Some of the biggest energy discoveries of all time have just happened in the last year. And you know, I'm going to tease you a little bit. Anyone know what that is? If it's a chemistry, that's kind of hard to see. So I'm going to blow it up a little bit. At the center is a carbon atom, and those are 4 hydrogens. More specifically, the hydrogen is 108 picometers above the carbon. And okay, I'll stop teasing you, I'm a geek. It's methane, it's natural gas, it's what you burn when you cook. It's a wonderful clean fuel. It produces half the CO2 that coal produces when you burn it, and gives you the same amount of energy. It has less sulfur and nitrogen compounds that make you cough. It's a wonderful fuel. And the United States recently has had the biggest discoveries of all time, as has England, as has Argentina, as has Poland. China has huge reserves. So everything has changed, but yet no one's talking about it because I think there's so much inertia, so much emotion and culture and programs tied up with the myth that there's a shortage of energy. There is no shortage of energy. And if you're interested in Kyoto and CO2, you should be celebrating, because the Kyoto Protocol only talked about reducing CO2 by single-digit percentages, and it was an abject failure because it didn't reduce it at all. Here you could reduce it by 50% if you just substituted natural gas for coal. So we should be celebrating. Finally, the New York Times had an article on it last week. The Wall Street Journal's been writing about it, but it really changes the world. So I just throw that out there for you entrepreneurs. Learn about the natural gas market and how that affects you. Think of the software opportunities. How is that going to change some of the trading markets, some of the logistics, shipping this natural gas around the world? It may seem like a chemistry invention, but as we noted yesterday, and as Naval said, you know, it's all code. Code affects each and every one of these industries. So that's my one tip for the day. And finally, I just want to describe where my firm is. I don't want to make this into a commercial, but we are all around the world, and we chose to expand in Asia first. And I just wanted, from an IP perspective, just wanted to talk about the importance of invention. I've always had Lenovo computers, which you know is a Chinese-made computer, and they're a very successful company. But to this day, when I buy a Lenovo computer, pretty much 100% of the profit goes to 2 American IP companies. One is called Intel, or AMD, and one is called Microsoft, because they had the intellectual property for the chip and for the software. Now, Lenovo and other Asian companies want to have the next Microsoft, the next Qualcomm. They don't just want to build products. They want to have the patents and own the IP. And that's why we're finding such a great reception all throughout Asia. Because I think people realize they need to go up that value chain, and they don't want to have to pay those billions of dollars to other companies because they were the only ones that were inventing. And a few statistics. I'll just say I'm most proud of the fact that we've paid out over $400 million in the last few years to individual inventors. So these are people working in their garages, people working at universities, in which case they have to split some of the money with the universities. But this is part of what we described at the beginning, allowing this ecosystem to build, allowing inventors to spend time on what they're best at, which is inventing. And we're equal opportunity folks. We've worked with hundreds of institutions and thousands of people around the world. And everywhere we go, we find inventors and entrepreneurs. As we talked about yesterday, we're all born entrepreneurs, but it gets beaten out of you by the system and by your family and by your companies and by the government. But in our hearts, we're all entrepreneurs. We do have a large laboratory in the Seattle area and a network of laboratories around the world, because you can't do this work. And some of them are computer laboratories. I don't want to give you the impression it's all beakers and natural gas experiments. And I'm just going to end off with a little bit about entrepreneurs and what we want to be. So you may not be able to read it in the back, so I'll just go through it quickly. Do you want to be empowered, or do you want to worry about compliance? Right? So the right side is what bureaucracies do. The left side is what entrepreneurs do. Innovation is valuable to an entrepreneur. If you're a bureaucrat, you want things to be methodical and predictable. You don't want to rock the boat. An entrepreneur doesn't worry about the small things. Bureaucrats care about process more than results. We need to fail. We talked about that a lot the last few days. You shouldn't be punished for failing. You shouldn't be shamed for failing. You should be celebrated for failing. You should take responsibility for yourself and for your failures, and you shouldn't feel entitled. You should feel urgent, and good intentions are not enough, right? And save the money you can. Don't spend what you have. Now, I don't mean to sound preachy, because big corporations can be entrepreneurial. Governments can be entrepreneurial. Portions of big corporations can be entrepreneurial, while the rest of it is bureaucratic. That's okay. We should all strive to make sure that whatever we're doing for a living has entrepreneurial tendencies. And great entrepreneurs, we've heard this throughout, they're stubborn, they're passionate, sometimes they're hard to work with, but they've changed the world, and without them, everything would be different, and the past doesn't matter, it's only the future. And finally, the essence of an innovative economy. We see a fish, a man fishing, and a bunch of seafood restaurants. So sure, if you give someone a fish, you've saved them for a day. You've heard this before. You teach them to fish, you save them for a lifetime. But that's not where we want to stop in this room. We want to keep encouraging people. If you enlighten people further, encourage them further, they'll own a chain of seafood restaurants. And that's what it means to be an entrepreneur. We shouldn't be happy just teaching people to fish. And this is the last slide. It's a Venn diagram showing the interdisciplinary nature of everything that we do. And it's never been a better time to be an entrepreneur. We have the internet, we have access to capital, we have easy access to information, rapid prototyping. I apologize for that font, you probably can't read it. But due to information technology, it's changed all parts of the entrepreneurial ecosystem, not just IT. So with that, I end on a note of hope. I firmly believe this is the Asian century. That's been said by many others, but you just see it all around you. And now we've got plenty of time for questions, and I would encourage everyone to step up and ask questions, challenge me, disagree with me, whatever you would like. The harder the question, the better.
Hello. Hello. My name is Lukman. You just call me Lukman. I have a few questions and something to disagree with you. It is unfair for an investor to ask, the inventor to spill out their ideas, okay? Because they are not protected. So it's unfair. Mm-hmm. So how are you going to protect them? Not even unoodle.com has the intellectual property protection, okay? So it's unfair for us. What if our idea is revealed and being plagiarized. It's so unfair.
No, that's a great question, and thank you for asking it. It's basically, so let me answer that first, because I have trouble remembering multiple questions. But if you have a great idea, you absolutely don't want to lose it. And if you give it to someone that is not trustworthy, you will lose it.
Agreed.
So what we do is we have formal procedures and processes where we get referrals. So maybe you don't know me, but I will put you in touch with someone that knows me that also knows you, and can say, hey, I've worked with Patrick before. They have a legal form we both sign at the beginning, which allows us to discuss it in private. And then if we work together, we jointly own the idea, and I protect it with you. I get patent attorneys. I help develop your idea. You can come in our lab with us, and so we'll jointly own it. So I do agree you have to be very, very careful about disclosure, but the good news is the industry has built mechanisms and procedures to take care of that case. But I take your question very seriously.
I agree with you, but the thing is, I'm living in Malaysia. This is Malaysia. Our intellectual property enforcement is at the minimal stage.
Yes.
You know, we have like we have SIRIM, we have SKMM, we have KPD, NKK. There's so many departments. They are not centralized.
Yep.
You know, so basically, I have experience with them. They will bounce you from one department A to B, B to C. You know, making you like a football.
Yes.
Okay.
No, I am sympathetic to you, and I understand your question. I've been working in China for 14 years now, and 14 years ago in China, it was even worse than what you described. And now China is much, much better because they've joined the community of nations. There's been a patent reform acts that have been passed in many countries to try to harmonize the rules around the world.
Okay.
And as you know, in Malaysia, many multinationals are doing high-tech manufacturing and even engineering design here. So I'm not saying that things shouldn't improve, but I do think things are a lot better than they are. And you and all of us in the room need to educate folks, need to work with the government, need to work with the private groups to make sure that the IP protection continues to get stronger. Because without it, the economy will never climb to that highest pinnacle of producing an Intel or a Microsoft or a Qualcomm.
Okay. Do you know that is there any IP website like, you know, ideasforfuture.com maybe, that integrated patent office, copyright office, trademark office, all in one?
So the quick answer is not really. There's some that try to be, but what you're describing is so complex because it involves laws from so many different jurisdictions. But that's a great idea. So for you entrepreneurs out there, think about it. How do we harmonize it? So thank you for the questions. Those were wonderful.
One last one.
No,
One last one.
Okay, a quick one.
Okay, I disagree with you on what you said. Nuclear fusion, you did nothing, right? For now. Don't know about 10 years, 20 years time.
Yep.
Apart from nuclear, we have antimatters, we have plasma energy.
Yep. No, you're entirely right. No one can predict the future, right? As Mark Twain said, making predictions is difficult, especially about the future, right? So if you don't know, I was just doing, it's one of the few areas I know a lot about, and so maybe I'm just too cynical and jaded. But hey, I'll keep an open mind. But thank you for the question. We've got some folks over there at the other microphone.
Hi, my name is Arman, and I'm curious to have your views on the change of the cost of product development for mechanical and chemical products in the past 10 years, if it has changed. And, let's say with regards to web applications, it's reached zero because of cloud compute, but how about those other products, and do you think there could be any changes?
Yeah, that's an important question. In fact, Rebecca and I were just talking about that before the session, that in IT we're blessed because the cost has almost gone to zero because of Moore's law. And that'll never be as big of a decrease in these other fields, but in chemistry and in product development it has come down quite a lot. Not orders of magnitude, but certainly by 50% here, 80% there, because of rapid prototyping. You know these fancy printers that are like dot matrix printers? Instead of shooting out ink, it shoots out plastic, and you could build a prototype in minutes. Where in the old days, you used to have to cast it or hack away at it with a hammer and chisel. Because of all the computing tools, you can comb through a database of molecules and target chemistries. You don't have to mix them all together. You can mix them all virtually, narrow it down to maybe 10 compounds that would work. So the good news is the cost of those things have gone down also, albeit not as much as in software. It just means we have to be more clever. So we shouldn't use it as an excuse. It's an opportunity. So next question, please.
Okay, hi, my name is Hakim. Okay, I have one question. All right, I would like to challenge you. Okay, you said that entrepreneur innovation is value, right? And the others is methodical. Mine, if I would like to know what's the difference between these two.
Between innovation is value versus being methodical?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't want to be the guy answering the question who all of a sudden backs down and says, oh yeah, I agree with you now. But my only point there was I was using the word methodical in an extreme sense, where that there was value in being methodical alone. Now, I do agree throughout the entire act of value creation, you have to be methodical, usually, although not really. When I was writing lots and lots of software, I was not methodical. I'd stay up late and I'd eat lots of food and frankly drink a lot of beer, and I'd just hack away. And I was not methodical, but I think I produced some pretty good code because it was more like art when I was doing that. It wasn't really science. So my only point there is bureaucracies focus too much on process as opposed to outcome. But I don't mean to be cavalier. Life isn't all about staying up late as a 23-year-old writing C code until the sun wakes up. Although I recommend everyone in their life should have a period of time where you do that because it kind of informs you for the rest of your life. But you should focus more on the value, however you as an individual need to create that value. So we should go over to the microphone on the other side.
Thank you. My name is Muhammad Dahan. I'm a research side. I like very much your chart showing the difference between the entrepreneur and the bureaucrat. Is it possible to show it again?
Yeah. How's that? How's that for, we call that positive feedback, it turns out. So let me do F5. Will the F5 work? Okay, so maybe we'll take another question and then we'll come back and put that chart on. But if you have a question on it, please, oh wait, here we go. Cool, this one.
Yeah, I like that chart very much. Now, in this country, we have about 1.2 million bureaucrats and 11 million people in the private sector. Now, the people in the private sector, I mean, we would like to assume because they are in business and they are professional, they would be quite entrepreneurial. Maybe just at least the bosses. Huh? But where do you place, my first question, where do you place the scientific mind? Because to me, the scientific mind is what has built modern civilization in the last 2 centuries, the scientific mind. So where do you place that? That's my first question. And my second question, if you want the people, the 1.2 million in the bureaucratic, with the bureaucratic mind, to maybe the top 10% to be entrepreneurial, how would you recommend the process of doing it?
Yeah, okay, so it's a 2-part question. First, I'm biased. I love technology. I give a lot of speeches in the United States where kids are not studying technology. In Asia, it's common for students to study engineering. In the US, most people that look like me, they want to be lawyers or accountants or dancers or artists, and that's fine, but you can't build a whole civilization based on that. So a lot of this is I just give kind of motivational speeches to try to get kids interested in science, to let them think that it's cool. So obviously, I place the science on the left side. That being said, there is a lot of big science that actually is not entrepreneurial. As to bureaucrats, I must say, I don't mean to insult anyone or to even use bureaucracy as a bad word. It's necessary. It's difficult to run a nation, whether it's a small nation like Singapore or Finland with 6 million people or China with 1.4 billion. It's difficult. You need some bureaucracy. It's just when it goes to extreme, it gets difficult. And I think what you do is you start small. You don't start big. It's really hard to change things top down in a bureaucratic culture. You start small. So here's one thing. If you work in a bureaucratic environment, you have a lot of meetings, right? They're probably scheduled for some default time, an hour, maybe 90 minutes. Instead, when someone tries to schedule it for an hour, you respond and say, you know what? I think we can do this in 30 minutes. Or better yet, why don't we do this via email? Maybe a little bit of real-time chatting, we can solve this issue. And that, there's an old saying, better to light one candle than to curse the darkness. And I think bureaucracies have to be changed a little bit at a time. And it'll never be perfect. And you talk about Malaysia, trust me, the United States government has a huge bureaucracy. Millions and millions of people, not just at the federal government, but at the state and the local. So we're as bureaucratic as any other country out there. So I don't necessarily hold the U.S. government up as some sort of efficient entity. But the U.S. is trying to change, and I think every government is trying to be more efficient. And all the big companies should too, right? I shouldn't excuse large companies, because large companies are very bureaucratic.
Last question. A child is born basically with an entrepreneurial mind, not a bureaucratic mind. And yet all over the world, more people tend to be bureaucrats than to be entrepreneurial. Where did we go wrong in raising the kids? Thank you very much.
Yeah, well, you know, some of these are value judgments. Yeah, there's something wonderful about a child, but, you know, if you put a bunch of kids over in the corner, at some point they're all going to starve, you know? So the bureaucracy has a purpose. You know, the bureaucracy organizes. The bureaucracy does things that no one person can do. So the bureaucracy arises because you do need it, otherwise you'd have chaos. The challenge is the pendulum swings too far in that direction. But I am no means in favor of somehow letting people relearn everything over and over again. And that's what would happen if you just let the entrepreneurial kids sit in the corner. They'd figure it out eventually, but they wouldn't benefit from the good and the bad that we've all learned. So look, you know, this type of thing you can't really prove one way or the other, but I do think it all starts with the individual to change. So
Thank you.
Question over there. Thank you for the question.
Hello, I'm Faisal. I'm an engineer. At the same time, I'm also a scientist. I got a small patent for my pseudogenes product. The problem is that on the venture capital, we were trying to get into the market which is bidding for the cost of a product. The problem is that when we go to individual venture capitalists, he wanted a short-term return, so our cost product is very high. So that wouldn't be good for our bidding. So we decided to go to small cooperatives. Community cooperatives who is willing to support us. But the amount of capital they give us is small. But they have a long-term return, which gives us a good cost of product. So here we have a dilemma of getting a venture capital who is willing to allow us to sell product at a lower cost. Can you help us in this?
Yeah, you know, unfortunately, I can't help you as much as I wish I could. I mean, when I travel around the world meeting with entrepreneurs and scientists, I wish I had access to an infinite amount of money, because I pretty much want to fund everybody, you know, because I get excited when I see these plans. What you describe as a common issue and kind of points to some of what we talked about yesterday. Ultimately, the rise of these super angels are really going to be the most important funding source, because they have the money and, quite frankly, they don't mind losing it. They're investing partially for the fun and the enjoyment and the satisfaction. When you go to professional venture capitalists, they often have a shorter time horizon because it's not their money. They're managing it on behalf of someone else who needs that money returned to them at a particular point in the future to meet their own liabilities. Maybe it's a pension fund that needs money to give to retirees. So it's hard, because how do you start that cycle? You don't get super angels until you have many successes and you generate a lot of rich people. We all like to demonize rich people, and, you know, Lord knows in the US we demonize rich people too, but if you didn't have rich people, you wouldn't have the surplus that they would invest in these entities. So I don't have any magic for you other than try to quantify the risk reward as a function of time, and you might make it more palatable to a professional investor, because they won't be able to quantify it. You have to help them with it. Yes, please.
James here. My question is, every day I will read the news, companies suing each other on the patents, right? It's kind of scary for me to enter markets. So do you think the patent system is actually slow down the innovations?
Yeah, you know, I've thought a lot about this through the years. Net, the patent system is a wonderful thing. There are some cases where it slows down innovation because it brings too many attorneys into the process. But by and large, the patent system is about two things, and it's been around for centuries. Societies throughout history have had the idea of protecting your intellectual property. People usually talk about the reward of the patent system, meaning I get a patent, and for 20 years I can exclude others from being in that area. But that's only one part of it. The other part of that bargain is disclosure. When you get the patent, you have to immediately publish it and tell people how to make and use your product. Now, they're not allowed to make and use it for roughly 20 years, but you have to tell them 20 years in advance. So think about that. It helps stimulate their own thinking so they can invent around that patent, create an ecosystem around it, or maybe come up with a way to do the same thing differently, and then they're not affected by the patent. But more importantly, when it expires after 20 years, That inventor just gave that idea away to the world for free. Now, 20 years may seem like a long time, but it really isn't. I think that's a pretty good societal bargain, because compare it with copyrights, which essentially last forever. Right now, if I draw a Mickey Mouse cartoon on the board, I can go to jail, because the Walt Disney Company has the copyright to Mickey Mouse, and there's criminal penalties in the United States, right, for counterfeit DVDs and CDs, and those copyrights last forever. So I don't know why more people don't pick on the copyright system. At least the patent system, after 20 years, you're done with it. And hey, in software, 20 years may be 20 product cycles, but in pharmaceuticals or chemistry, that may be one product cycle. So I could make the case that the patent system should have stronger protection for inventors. That being said, you are correct, is that there are too many disagreements. There are too many patents that are granted that are obvious. But I think the patent bodies throughout the world have realized that, and they're trying to fix it. And back to the internet and ICT, patents that are issued today are better than ever, because now the patent examiner, with a few keystrokes, can find prior art, can find context. Where in the old days that was harder, and so many patents slipped through that actually were not novel. But thanks for the question. I mean, as you know, patents, we could teach a 12-month course on it and still not cover all the issues, but thanks for asking that. So how are we doing on time? Another... Okay, so we have 5 minutes, so there's another question over there.
I'm Kamar. Yeah, you wrote there that you have 35,000 patents, right? And then it's all under your management throughout the world. So let's say I'm a startup. I manage to patent something in Malaysia, but I don't have enough funds to patent it in US, Europe, or other large demographic countries. So if I go and see you and sign up all these things, can you... is there some form of platform where people like me negotiate those IPs, and then the patents go through you, but you file in all different countries?
Yes, absolutely. That's a big part of what we do, because it is a big world. The planet recently passed 7 billion people, as you know. What's interesting is there's about 310 million in the US and, I don't know, 360 million in Europe, depending on where you draw the boundary. So less than 10% of the world are Europeans or Americans. You know, it's a really teeny percentage. But yet, in the old days, all you had to do is patent in the US and maybe Germany and England and Japan. But now things have changed so much as the economies rejigger, and that's hard for an entrepreneur because you want to protect your IP in so many more countries. So part of what we do is we do work with entrepreneurs in local geographies and help them protect their IP around the world. But we try to get in early, because if a patent's been filed already, depending on the particular rules, it might be too late to file in some of the other countries. So it gets very, very technical. But that's a great question, and all of you need to think about that, especially if you're in a very tech-heavy area like pharmaceuticals. Software, not so much, because the product cycles are like this.
So let's say my patent is with you. If somebody has a patent with you, so they can access other patents that within your portfolios at a cheaper rate licensing?
So that's a specific question, and that's really hard to answer. The real answer is it depends. We have a variety of different programs that we have for both small, medium, and large-sized companies. And we're also a startup in a sense. We're sort of working on these programs as we go along. But the quick answer is yes, because we try to add value to our customers, both in terms of old innovation and new innovation. So we have our lab where we come up with new innovation, and then we also have existing patents that are part of our portfolio. So are there other questions? Yes?
Hi, good afternoon. My name is John. I'd just like to seek your opinion and advice. So I have this idea. So I have basically identified some human problems, and my idea would be a solution for these problems, whether locally or globally. The only hurdle that I see at the moment is that it requires quite a bit of heavy investment in terms of infrastructure. So at this point in time, obviously, the VCs are not going to look into this because I don't have anything tangible. So what should I do from here?
Yeah, you know, I'm not going to lie to you. I wish I had an easy answer. You have to look for non-traditional sources of funding, which are difficult. Sometimes governments will step in. You can convince an NGO, a non-governmental organization. Some of the big nonprofit foundations will come in. As you know, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is the largest foundation in the world, and they're very active all over the world. And sometimes they will fund big ideas like that. But you know, the problem is they literally get tens of thousands of requests for funding, and they only have the bandwidth. I think they have plenty of money, but they only have the bandwidth to monitor, you know, I don't know, I have to look at their website, but, you know, scores of programs, you know, 60, 80, maybe a couple hundred, which means most people come away disappointed. So I have no magic answer for you on that. All right, we're down to a minute. If there's no final questions, one last chance.
I think we're done here, Patrick. Do you want to just wrap up and, you know, say your closing thoughts?
All right. Well, this, you know, I think we've had a really good session here. I don't have much to add other than to thank you for your candor. Those are some of the best questions I've gotten. I've given varieties of this talk all around the world, and this was the most interactive session we've had and the best questions. So thank you.
Patrick Ennis, ladies and gentlemen, Head of Global Technology at Intellectual Ventures.